everybody to our third Tune In Tuesday event, Wildlife on the Monument. Tonight's event is going to work similar to our other two, where we're going to try to save most questions until the end of the night. But if you do have a question that pops up, please feel free to type it into the chat box, and we'll get to it either during the discussion or later on in the night. We will save the last 20 or 30 minutes for audience questions, so that'll be the time that you can unmute yourself, turn on your videos, and ask Jesse any questions that have come up. But with that, I'll start with introductions. My name is Michaela Moss, and I am the Acting Executive Director for the Friends of the Missouri Breaks Monument. And for those of you who don't know us, the Friends is a small nonprofit organization based out of Helena, Montana. And our mission is to preserve and protect the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument through education, stewardship, and advocacy. And we were founded in the same year that the monument was dedicated as a national monument back in 2001. So that makes this year both of our 20th anniversaries. So to kind of celebrate that milestone, we've been putting on these Tune In Tuesday educational events, bringing in experts in a variety of fields tied to both the Friends and to the monument. And tonight we are lucky enough to be joined by Jesse Hankins, the BLM wildlife biologist for the monument. So welcome, Jesse. We're really excited to have you tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to you to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit more.
All right, well, thank you, Michaela, and thank you to all those in the virtual room this evening joining us. This is admittedly my first time doing this, if you guys can believe that or not. I've been able to avoid this platform for a year now, so this is my maiden voyage. So you guys are you're lucky, and you're the guinea pig. So if I stub my toe, I apologize. But thank you for tuning in tonight, and thank you for the opportunity, Michaela, and the Friends group for letting me participate tonight in this tune-in event. With that, I'm going to apologize up front for the long-winded introduction, but I think it's important to kind of wrap it all together. But my name is Jesse Hankins, monument biologist. I received a call about a year ago when I put in for the position here at the monument, and have been sitting in Lewistown since 2020 as the monument biologist here. And prior to that, I was 5 years in Alaska with the BLM, working for the Glen Allen Field Office, a large office in South Central Alaska. Prior to that, I had about 8 years with the BLM in Miles City as a wildlife biologist as well. My first seasonal experience as a BLM employee was actually in the monument in 2007. I was hired by Mitch Forsyth and Jody Peters, two retired BLM employees, to come on board in 2007 as a seasonal. And really, you know, I truly enjoyed that summer as a seasonal. It was my first professional experience with the BLM. Had a lot of personal experience with BLM through hunting and recreating in public lands, but never professionally, if you will. And it really opened my eyes to a new opportunity. And I guess the rest is history. I kind of went down the BLM path. I always wanted to be a fish, wildlife, and parks biologist, but that didn't pan out. So went down the route of the BLM biologist route. And here I am today, 14 years later, actually now the monument biologist. But before that, I had personal experience in the monument. I grew up in a small community, which I'll refer to as a bedroom community to the monument. I anchored down South Shoto County in Square Butte, Montana, for anybody that knows where that is. So that's my stomping grounds as a young kid, grew up there recreating on public lands. And I was fortunate to be on the south side of the monument prior to it being a monument. Saw a lot of that country in the uplands from both the BLM and the private lands, and fortunate to see the eye of the needle before its demise, and had quite a bit of experience on the south side of the monument, not so much the north side, but very fortunate, very blessed to be able to get back to this part of the world and play some small role in public lands management as a wildlife biologist. So there's my introduction. And again, sorry, long-winded, but it came full circle. With that, I also, is it up to me, or can I take it from here, Michaela, talk about kind of the role of a biologist?
Take it away, yeah. And hey, that was a great introduction.
Yeah. So looking at the agenda here that I provided, and it looks like it was approved. So I guess we'll talk briefly about the role of a biologist. So I don't know how many folks are familiar with the different federal agencies and what we do as biologists, but unlike what you might see on a Friday night in the Discovery Channel or Nat Geo, where we're not wrestling babies and putting collars on critters and doing all that real, sometimes very appealing type work. We're truly habitat biologists. We manage landscapes, and as the title suggests, the Bureau of Land Management, we're truly habitat biologists. So again, chose a different path, wanted to be that FWP person at one time, but now truly landscapes and habitat. So in summer months, often what we'll be doing is working as part of a larger IDT, interdisciplinary team, and we'll be out in the field collecting vegetation data, shrub data, riparian data, things of that nature that feeds into larger planning efforts through watershed health, things of that nature, making sure that we're as a multiple use agency, providing that habitat for a suite of different critters. And that's a portion of my field going activities in the summer months. We'll get into it a little bit later in the evening, but also a little bit of opportunity to do wildlife surveys, inventory and monitoring on some key species, do that through some of the spring and summer months. And then admittedly, the largest portion of my job is actually riding a chair at a desk. And it's just being honest with folks. And I tell kids that come here and do internships with us too. It's the reality of it. And it is a portion of my job, and I'll try to describe that too. And by and large, as a federal agency, anytime we engage in an action, whether we're permitting something, we're spending dollars on something, we're proposing something ourselves internally, essentially what we're doing is going through an environmental review, if you will, that falls in line with NEPA, and often that's an environmental assessment. So I, as a wildlife biologist, I essentially wear the hat for wildlife and wildlife habitats. And my role is to disclose impacts through this document for managers to make informed decisions. So again, whether we're issuing a right-of-way or we're issuing a permit for a special recreation permit for outfitters and guides to go down the Missouri River, or it's even an internal project that we're proposing for, say, a prescribed burn or something like that. It's my role as a biologist to basically provide that analysis for the public and the manager to make an informed decision. So that is a pretty substantial portion of my time is kind of administrative and environmental review type stuff. So that's kind of in a nutshell what a biologist might do. Again, not maybe not what you thought they did. If it was different than what you thought, you should raise your hand. Is it different than what you thought, or is that kind of what folks gathered? All right, fair enough. And this is interesting to talk to the computer string, trying to interact with you folks out there in the virtual world. I'll do my best, but it is different and it is new for me to interact in this way. So thanks for the thumbs up.
Yeah, I'll jump in there and just say that if you're willing, please go ahead and turn on your videos. I know they were turned off when you first logged in, but we'd love to see your faces. It is nice to see reactions.
Oh, okay.
So, you can go ahead and turn on your videos if you'd like.
Okay. Heck, I thought you were talking to me, Michaela, and I was thinking, dang, what do you see if they don't see me? All right, well, with that said, I think the monument is unique for a couple of reasons, but largely coming right into the proclamation, the biological objects. I think what really sets us apart from those adjacent BLM lands that simply show up as yellow on the landscape is truly the proclamation. And the proclamation, I'm sure that folks are aware, but 2001 presidential proclamation designated the monument, and largely for its biological, let me think about this, biological, historical, and geological objects of the monument, a spectacular array throughout the monument. And essentially that's what, the reason we move forward with this decision, designation, and the resulting monument management plan was essentially a vision to maintain and protect those objects that were identified. So again, there's a suite of objects identified, but that was literally the first sentence of the proclamation talking about objects. And again, that's what kind of makes us unique as a management unit for the BLM. These other BLM offices don't have these objects, if you will. So it was something that I had to kind of pick up and learn in the year I've been here, because I've never been familiar with objects. It's another thing to be aware of as we move forward with these planning efforts. All right, so here's where I'm going to try the screen share. I'm going to share a screen, and we're going to go over a couple of these objects. All right, can you see my title page here? Thumbs up, thank you. So Upper Missouri River Breaks, that's what I work for. And I do have my BLM logoed shirt on tonight. I had to make sure I did that. Keep the manager happy. Tune in Tuesday, March 2nd, 2021. Thanks for joining us. So again, the proclamation, and we're talking about biological objects. So these are literally quotes right out of the proclamation from 2001. And it refers to one of the premier bighorn sheep herds in the United States, perching and nesting habitat for many raptors, speaks to 48 fish species, several pairs of bald eagle nests, important spawning habitat for pallid sturgeon, the most viable elk herd in Montana, habitat for prairie dogs, and specifically it talks of Arrow Creek containing the largest concentration of antelope and mule deer. And then it speaks to the abundant plant life along the river and across the Breaks country. And it goes on and on. I mean, there's literally several dozens of things that have been identified as biological objects. And, you know, the reason we're moving forward with a management plan to enhance and protect those objects really comes down to the proclamation. So as I mentioned earlier, we're a habitat management agency, but if you notice, it talks specifically about pallid sturgeon, specifically about the Arrow Creek drainage, mule deer, pronghorn, and just an opportunity to show some of those photos. I can't take credit for all these. The landscape photos BLM has credit for, but the other wildlife photos are through a SharePoint. But again, you look in the upper left, we're talking about large landscapes. That's typically what BLM manages as habitat and landscapes, but then the proclamation speaks specifically to things like ferruginous hawks and pronghorn and pallid sturgeon, bighorn sheep. And then not only that, it identifies some of these key landscapes on the ground. It speaks specifically to the bullwhacker area being large, wild, and remote. And then also the Arrow Creek drainage because of its the riparian functionality of it. And then the cottonwood galleries on the Judith River. So again, it's really this proclamation that's unique to us as a management unit. And these are some of the again, the things that make us unique, but the things that kind of push us beyond just being a habitat management agency. By no means am I saying we're taking over management of cows or, excuse me, cow elk, I'm looking at cow elk here, or pronghorn, but it kind of gives us a flexibility to engage in additional information on some of these species that maybe other BLM offices, if you will, the adjacent yellow lands don't really have the luxury of doing that. So it kind of confused the matter a little bit. We're a habitat management agency, but now we're starting to talk about species as well. So with that, some of the evening topics I would like to touch on tonight is some of the inventory, monitoring, and trends of the objects, some key objects over the last 20 years. Talk about some past, present, future projects that we're working on, some partnerships, some of the folks that help us to be successful, and then things of recent interest. And I have to chuckle here a little bit. If folks are really hoping to learn more about grizzly bears and monarch butterflies, I'm unfortunately not your guy. I'm just here to help share some information as it is timely as we learn a little bit more about grizzly bears and monarch butterflies. So with that said, I think I'm going to get back into me, I think. Let me look here. Yeah, we'll do this. All right, so can you see me again? All right, so I want to speak to, one of those objects identified in the monument was bald eagles. And early on, and even prior to the monument designation in 2001, for the longest time, there were about 3 active nest territories in the river corridor for bald eagle. And this is visiting with the previous biologist, Jody Peters, as well as looking at FWP data. Again, for the longest time, about 3 active territories within the river corridor. There's been a lot of conservation efforts across the West for bald eagles. And, it wasn't just because we designated the monument in 2001 that we now have far more eagles on the landscape. It's really a success story of the bird itself. But in 2007, it was delisted and no longer protected under the Endangered Species Act, but it is still a special status species for BLM. It's still a biological object that we're interested in. And something that changed with the 2001 designation was BLM's increased focus on it as an object, I guess, if you will. So I think a more concerted effort was taken to try to identify additional nesting territories. With that said, today there's about 24 nest territories in the river corridor, and not always are those territories active, but I think this past year when I floated the river, I think we had 15 active nests. And again, a success story, not only in the monument, but kind of nationwide, obviously. And some of the information we use for those, I guess I'll back up. In the spring, like April, we'll float the river and identify those nests, see if they're active or not. In years previous, we were really focused on productivity and things of that nature, but we're not so much in that realm anymore. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks isn't necessarily in the realm of production data anymore, and it's more of an activity. It's either it's an active nest or it's a non-active nest, and really what that does for us now is helps us to mitigate potential impacts adjacent to those nest territories if in fact they are active. So that's one of those key species, the biological objects that, again, we focused on early once the monument was designated. And something else I'll point out, by and large, all the suitable habitat is occupied by eagles in the monument. It's not likely that we'll probably see a big increase again over these 20 birds. We've kind of hit the asymptote there, and that's probably where it's going to be. I could be wrong, but likely we're probably not going to see a big influx of more birds as far as nesting birds in the corridor. So that's bald eagles. Another species of concern is the greater sage grouse. And again, it's much bigger than just the monument. It's BLM wide, west wide, greater sage grouse. It was definitely something that was identified in the proclamation. Some of the key wintering habitat on the north side of the river was identified in the proclamation. And I think something that's worth noting is it's the upper Missouri River breaks, and naturally the breaks are a broken, highly erosive, often timbered habitat. So we don't have broad expanses of sage grouse, sep and sage grouse habitat, but we do have some key spots where it's these connecting the dots between bigger populations. The folks to the east of us, Malta Field Office and Miles City and Lewistown, they have some really large contiguous sagebrush steppe habitats. With that said, we have about 12 leks in the monument, and of those, I believe 7 are on BLM administered lands, a couple of them on state, and obviously a couple on private. And with that said, we get out each spring and we monitor those leks. We go out to these known communal breeding sites. For folks that have never experienced a sage grouse lek, I encourage you all to get up bright and early this spring and find somebody that's willing to take you out to a lek, because it's powerful. It's quite awesome. A spring morning, a crisp, cool air is hitting you in the cheeks, and the birds are singing, and you finally hear them thumping for the first time. It's surely a sight that everybody should enjoy. So that's my task for you that haven't experienced that yet. Find someone that'll take you to a lek this spring. So that's what we do. We try to get to these leks 3 times a year and get the high male count. We're looking at the males in particular. They're big, they're flashy, they're showy. They're looking for an opportunity to breed a hen, and they're kind of the index to the population for us. So we're counting the number of males, and then we're feeding that information up into a bigger database with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, so they can have an idea of what populations are doing. So a quick story, DY Junction, it would be north of Kip, DY Junction, if folks are familiar with that. This past year, I had just gotten back. I came back in February from Alaska. I was happy to be back to Montana. I got out on the ground to do lek surveys, just what I explained to you, the crisp air on your cheeks, seeing the sun come up, it was awesome. And this lek had about 60 birds on it for a high male count. And I took the previous count data with me, and I went out there and I came in on it. I was glassing it from quite a ways away, and I just had a feeling there were more birds. And I ended up walking in there, 300 or 400 yards, and I crested this little knoll, and gosh, there was bird after bird after bird. Ended up being 125 males. It was twice the highest count ever out there. And instantly I knew I better document it, or some of my cohorts would give me a hard time and told me I didn't know how to count, or wouldn't believe me. But with that said, we had a great year, and that was not an anomaly. I mean, it was twice the high count, but there were birds on the landscape in a lot of places this past year. We had really a good year for sage grouse. You know, through the 2013-14-ish, the numbers were down quite a bit. They rose, they trended upward for 3 or 4 years and kind of started trending back downward. But the last 2 years have been really good years for sage grouse. And by and large, the things that are influencing sage grouse is more environmental than anything, whether it be drought, it could be hail, it could be spring moisture. But something to just think about, and some of the challenges we have as a multiple use agency is this past year was somewhat of an outbreak year for grasshoppers in some portions of central Montana. And we as an agency had requests from producers that are obviously have a grazing permit, they have forage on the landscape, and adjacent to private lands, there were requests to come in there and do a chemical application for suppression of grasshoppers. And there's a risk to their resource. However, there's a benefit to sage grouse. Sage grouse benefit greatly from grasshoppers, in particular juveniles and broods. So on one hand, it's this challenge as managers that they have to kind of balance this potential risk towards this resource, but potential benefit towards this resource. So that's kind of the challenge and the opportunities with the multiple use agency. It's always a challenge, but there's always an opportunity, and it keeps it interesting. So just something to think about. So that's sage grouse. Going to move into prairie dogs. So prairie dogs, it's interesting. The very first specimen I believe collected was during the Lewis and Clark expedition. As they were headed upriver, they collected a black-tailed prairie dog and sent it back to Thomas Jefferson, and it was labeled as a new specimen. It was new to science. So that's pretty neat, some of our local history here and the significance of that expedition. And it was a biological object, identified as a biological object. It was important back then, it's important now. So for us getting out on the landscape, we're looking at populations of black-tailed prairie dogs where there's colonies. Something to note about the black-tailed prairie dog at the time of Lewis and Clark's travels, since that time, there's been anywhere from like a 95% to a 98% reduction in prairie dog habitat, if you will. And it's through loss of habitat. It's through, it really comes down to loss of habitat. So it is a key species on the landscape for us. It's considered a keystone species, and largely because of the role it plays for other critters. It's a habitat engineer, if you will, through all the tunneling, the burrows, the disturbance, the altered vegetation adjacent to the colony. So it's really quite neat what it will do, again, known as an ecosystem engineer, creating these different opportunities for different species. Some literature says that maybe up to 150 different species can benefit from a prairie dog colony or complex. So that's pretty neat of it when you think of it in that context. So things we do is get out on the ground, and for the most part, you don't find new prairie dog towns. We have a pretty good handle on where they are. Not to say that there aren't some that we identify as new to us or new to the agency, but for the most part, we have a pretty good handle on where the prairie dog towns are. And what we're doing is we're getting out to them at some period of time and mapping them geospatially, seeing if they're expanding, contracting, looking at burrow density, and then also looking to see what other species are utilizing those colonies, whether it be a ferruginous hawk, mountain plovers. Obviously black-footed ferret is a potential. However, we don't have great potential in the monument just because we don't have the complexes large enough to really support ferrets. Our neighbors to the south and east, the CMR, definitely have had some recovery efforts for black-footed ferret. They have more potential in that regard, but we don't really necessarily on the monument. But the thing that's challenging with black-tailed prairie dogs is they're really susceptible to plague. So it's hard for me to say or share a trend in the monument for the last 20 years. Some will continue right along and they plague out, and it's kind of boom or bust for a lot of these different dog towns. So to share a trend would be kind of challenging for me. So those are kind of some of the 3 species that we've really focused on in the monument, but I think there's more opportunity, and something that I think was maybe missed in the proclamation, maybe not missed, but it was obvious to me, is it was the big charismatic megafauna that was identified, the majestic elk, the bighorn sheep, the bald eagle. And there is a lot of missed opportunity for maybe the songbirds and the non-game things and things of that nature, where there's great value in these large intact habitats, these big landscapes where we have some opportunity for a lot of this non-game type stuff. So I think that's something else that's unique about the monument is with a monument, there's a science plan that basically is supposed to be like a visionary document taking us in a direction. What are the science needs of the monument relative to the objects? What are some of the questions we need to help answer management questions? And then also just what is science needs just to better understand the objects of the monument and how to protect those objects of the monument. So I think that's a neat opportunity that we have because of where our monument status is, that additional science opportunity, if you will, in this pretty large intact landscape. So with that, I think I'll move into some of the past, present, future projects. Do I need to take a break and like ask questions, or should we keep rolling, Michaela? What do you think? I don't see anybody nodding off yet.
I don't see anything in the chat, so I think you
Okay.
can cruising.
All right, sounds good. Well, I've got 2.5 hours later. Are you guys up for that? No, I'm joking. I'm joking.
Don't make me panic.
Yeah. All right, look at this agenda here. All right, so some of the past, present, future projects relative to the objects of the monument. So again, my tenure here is pretty short. I've only been here a little over a year, but in visiting with Jody Peters, the previous biologist, some of the previous staff, and just looking back through some of the project files, some of the things I think worth mentioning is this effort for prescribed fire. And prescribed fire wasn't necessarily an effort to benefit an individual species. It was more of an ecosystem health type approach to land management. You know, there's been a great shift in the fire return intervals in a lot of these landscapes. West-wide and Montana is no different. We have far more ponderosa pine, far more Rocky Mountain juniper in some of these broken landscapes, just because we're not burning as often as we were frequently. And this incorporation of prescribed fire was a way to, you know, set back succession, open up canopies, and basically start creating some of these early successional environments again across some of these broader landscapes. So again, those efforts aren't necessarily species specific, saying we're going to burn for this critter. It's bigger than that, and there's a suite of critters that will benefit from this, and trying to provide some of that mosaic on the landscape. So my predecessor, Jody Peters and Mitch Forsyth, both were advocates of fire and incorporating fire back into the landscape. And they were able to get some burns incorporated in the North Fork of the Lion Coulee area on the north side of the monument. And again, in the rain trap area, which is, it'd be north of the Cow Creek WSA, and basically right up against the Haber Field Office boundary on the west side of the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, kind of up there in that country. And again, it wasn't species specific, but you know, a broader goal of getting some mosaic back on the landscape. And with that said, we participated. I did participate, but it wasn't optional. A big planning effort, land health, watershed planning effort that we referred to as the Judith to Judith, Judith River to the Judith Mountains. And it doesn't accurately reflect where the geographical scope was, but it sounds good when you say it to the public. But it was a big planning effort for the monument and the Lewistown Field Office. And within that planning effort, we identified several areas on the south side of the monument. And I'm looking at my map on the wall here, guys. The south side of the monument in that lower Woodhawk area and going upriver, upriver ways, and then coming all the way back down into the CMR boundary. And there's quite a few units in there that have been identified for prescribed fire as well. And it's not only prescribed fire, but there's some other options. Mechanical treatment, it's far more selective, but it's definitely more expensive. But it is another option that folks like to have. And some of those, you know, present, future projects are probably going to be in that south side of the river in that area, kind of from the CMR boundary going upriver. And so that's some of the prescribed fire type stuff. Another thing that we've done recently, not necessarily prescribed fire, but mechanical or veg treatment work, is in the Antelope Creek area. There was a pretty big swing this past year to actually contract the removal of, for simplicity's sake, I'll say encroaching conifers, whether it be juniper or ponderosa pine. Some of these trees that are maybe encroaching out into sagebrush steppe habitats that are, it's not beneficial for sagebrush obligate species, in particular not sage grouse. So it's a habitat alteration project to remove some of these trees from the landscape. And in years previous, the Biologist was using a volunteer effort, if you will, the Montana Conservation Corps, to come out there, and he'd train them up with chainsaws, and they'd go out and cut for a week and treat about 10 acres or more. And it was a good experience for the crew, and it was having some effect on the landscape. But I think there was an idea that we really needed to scale it up to make it meaningful. And in the past year, in that Antelope Creek area in particular, some lands were identified out there, and several thousand acres have actually been treated out there adjacent to some leks. And that's something we're going to focus on moving forward too, is some more of these treatments in some of that sagebrush steppe habitat. And some areas in particular are going to be up there off the west end of that Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, Spencer Ridge Road, some of that country. We have a couple leks out there, and it's kind of these island leks adjacent to not very good sage grouse habitat, but they're really important as kind of this connectivity to bigger populations adjacent to it. So that's an opportunity for the BLM and some partners. Pheasants Forever and their habitat biologists is also working with us on that, and also some treatment on state as well, DNRC land. So kind of this partner approach to treating a broader landscape. What else do I have on the ticket? Okay, another one, a prescribed fire that I failed to mention is actually the Antelope Creek. And this is closer to the CMR, down low. It's a cooperative project with the BLM and the CMR. The CMR is the lead on this project. They completed their portion of the NEPA review. We had to complete our portion of the NEPA review, but it's going to be one big contiguous fire. And to be honest, I believe there is also some private lands in the fire as well, and potentially a small portion of state land. And again, it's a broader effort. And again, it's not single species management. It's putting fire back on the landscape and creating this mosaic and having this release for herbaceous vegetation, browse, woody browse for ungulates. And that's a project where CMR is involved, BLM, and Northwest Energy actually was a partner on that as well to help fund some of the cultural clearances to do that burn. And that is actually slated to be ignited this May as soon as they come into prescription. So that's one that will be on the books here this year, and likely, hopefully, there will be some smoke in the air. So let's see, that's prescribed fire fuels treatment. Coming into habitat restoration work, I talked about that, the sage grouse work in around Hay Coulee. Another thing, I guess, that from a habitat standpoint, it's often not thought of as habitat, but it truly is habitat when we're looking at it from the opportunity of a critter to use the landscape at will. And it's barrier fences. And woven wire or a 6-wire fence, or a very tight fence that's low to the ground. And actually even a loose fence is more impactful than a tight fence, if you can believe that. Tight fences make good neighbors. Tight fences are actually better for wildlife too, to be honest. If you find these landscapes that have these barrier type fences on it, it's precluding critters from moving from preferred habitat from one end to the other. So we've identified some of these spots on the landscape and using partners. I'm hopeful the Friends will be engaged, and MWF as well. And maybe we're going to roll up some of these fences this summer and get rid of some of these barrier type fences on the landscape. And ideally, there is a modeling effort to go at where you get the most bang for your buck on the landscape. But there's also another approach to it, is where you have willing operators that are willing to work with you. And you just go out there in a volunteer effort and you roll up woven wire fence, and you come back in with a 3-wire fence and a bottom wire smooth. and you start opening up these landscapes. So there's a couple different approaches on how to do that. And that's kind of the approach we've taken. We have willing cooperators, and we have some willing labor, and we have some money to provide materials. And that's another thing that we're focusing on and trying to build that up, if you will. So that's some of the project work. And I failed to mention a lot of the partners. There's so many partners that have helped over the years to help all that work. We've gotten a lot of help out of the Friends over the years with the riparian plantings and a lot of the river sweeps and things of that nature. And in fact, they've even had in the early years, I understand, they were doing some wildlife observations and filling out data sheets for the BLM as well. And that's something I'd kind of like to mention is, I think the BLM, I think we're really missing out on a big citizen science opportunity with so many people going down the river at this corridor. A lot of people focus on the river, the corridor. We have like 5,000 registered floaters a year. And I think there's a lot of people that want to be engaged as a citizen scientist. How can they help? How can they collect data? How can they feed it into something bigger? And that's something I'm working on. Working on that with some different agencies in the Heritage Program and trying to figure out what makes the most sense and what's meaningful and what's going to be useful after we collect that information. But everybody has a smartphone these days. There's so many apps that help you collect data, whether it's photo points or helps you ID animals. And I think that's something that I'd like to help build from the monument standpoint as a citizen science opportunity. With that said, we have partnered with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on what I think is pretty cool. There's quite a few pallid sturgeon that are radio tagged in the river. There's about 4 different other native species that are radio tagged. And for those of you that have floated the river, you've probably seen these at like Judith Landing, Coal Banks, Stafford Ferry. It's a solar panel that's probably about 4 feet square. And it's got a big aluminum Yagi antenna pointing out towards the river. Well, that is a static site that is pinging fish as they swim by. It takes a reading as soon as that tagged fish swims by, but it's static. So the only time it collects data is when the fish swims by the station. So we're taking kind of the opposite approach. We're putting the station in the boat. We're getting these encapsulated telemetry receivers that essentially will have all the mechanisms inside an otter box. And we're gonna make them available almost like a citizen science opportunity. When people come to the interpretive center or they come to Coal Banks, they can take this unit, they can put it in their canoe, they can put it on their jet boat, and it's passive telemetry. They don't even have to be engaged other than make sure it doesn't fall out the boat. Turn it on in the morning, turn it off at night. And there's enough battery and enough juice to keep that thing going for probably up to 4 days. And that's something that I think is really neat. We're taking an opposite approach to it and collecting all that data, and citizen science will be helping that. The Friends are definitely going to be on board with that. They're going to be taking that thing down the river a couple times a month for sure and helping bolster that data set for pallid sturgeon as well as a couple other species. And I got to be honest, I can't take the credit for that. I helped facilitate the funding to make that work and get it in the right hands, but really that was an idea that I was brainstorming with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks about how can we help you guys. And that's kind of, what we came up with. So Luke Holmquist from FWP was kind of the one that planted that seed. And I went and found the funding and got the units bought. And, the Friends are helping us. I think it's a neat project, and it's really going to bolster that data set for pallid sturgeon as well as some other critters. So that's citizen science. Let's see, I got to look at this. How am I doing for time, Michaela?
Doing great. We got about a little over 15 minutes left. So.
Okay. So getting into the things of recent interest. All right. So raise your hand if you showed up to learn about grizzly bears. All right, good. Oh, dang it. I'm not your guy. I'm going to share a different screen here. Actually, let me share just a little bit of information. So in preparation of this presentation tonight, I thought, all right, we're talking about expanding grizzly bear populations. I went back and did a little bit of Google. I Googled to see where Lewis and Clark saw their first bear on the trip west, and it was actually at Mobridge, South Dakota. So if you think about Mobridge, South Dakota, I'm just guessing 500-600 miles southeast of here as the crow flies, or to the east of us. And we're talking about grizzly bear expansion. So that's where they saw their first grizzly bears at Mobridge. It wasn't until kind coming right inside Montana, they actually shot their first grizzly bear, and then actually find out there was a total of 43 grizzly bears killed by the crew, and countless more were wounded and ran off in the bushes for sure. But a total of 43 grizzly bears harvested by the crew. So I'm gonna jump into my screen share here and show the PowerPoint. So we've gotten through some of these things. We're gonna talk about expanding grizzly bears. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we as a federal agency, anytime we permit something, we fund something, we engage in an activity, we go through this environmental review. And the same is said for threatened and endangered species. We work closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and basically make an effects determination on our action. How will our action affect this species? Excuse me. And we want to ensure that our actions aren't leading to potential for greater conservation concern for these species. So this right here is a map that was recently shared with the federal agencies, January 11th, 2021. And this is basically a may be present map for grizzly bears. And again, at one time there was, not turn of the century, 1975, the grizzly bear was listed, and there was a thought of anywhere from 800 to 1,000 grizzly bears on the landscape in the lower 48. There are a lot of grizzly bears in Alaska, I can attest to that, had them in our yard frequently, but the lower 48 is a different story. Less than 1,000 bears listed in 1975. So I mean, bears have come a long way, and the social aspect of grizzly bears have come a long way, and there's getting to be bears on the landscape where there haven't been for 100 years. With that said, the maybe present map is expanding, and that's why I'm sharing it with folks today. For the first time, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, based on data they've received from partners with the state, federal agencies, they're updating their maybe present map. So let's see. If you can see my cursor right there, this is Little Sandy. I'll zoom in here. And basically what this is just a GIS map I put together, but this blue shading right here is where they're saying is the maybe present for grizzly bears. And for folks that are familiar with this area, a lot of this is predominantly agricultural landscape. This is tillage agricultural landscape, but what you do have here is some major corridors. You have the Teton, you have the Marias River, and some of these major corridors. So this is basically saying all this country west of Loma is now a maybe present for grizzly bears. And last year there was a grizzly bear that was traveling through this country and came into Loma country and made it through Loma and north up to Big Sandy, and they had spottings of it at Big Sandy, which is why I'm assuming this maybe present stuff is popping here. And then it kind of fell off the radar. They don't have locations of it after Big Sandy, but just bringing this to folks' attention if you're recreating in the river and being in those landscapes, just something to be aware of. But what it means for us as an agency is that we're taking a hard look when we're permitting activities in these landscapes. And for us, it's quite minimal. This whatever this color is here, orangish color, is our monument boundary. It's tight to the river right here, the Wild and Scenic River Corridor. And when you actually get to Coal Banks, that's when the monument boundary broadens out and it actually gets into the uplands. But if you look down here at Loma, we have a little bit of overlap at Wood Bottom where it's showing up as maybe present. And then again up here at Little Sandy, this is the Little Sandy campsite right here. And again, from a BLM standpoint for us, it really doesn't change much what we're doing. We're just taking a hard look at these permitted activities, and grizzly bear may be present. Again, bears are getting out into landscapes they haven't for 100 years, and it's likely only going to keep expanding. And a natural corridor is the Missouri River Monument. It's the breaks. In time, there will probably be more blue polygons out here, if you will. All right, so the monarch butterflies. Who's here for the monarchs? So I am not a subject matter expert. I apologize. I wish I was. I'm just sharing this information as it's being shared with us as an agency. Again, this is kind of tying in with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the threatened and endangered species. And I got to be honest, when I was in Alaska for the last 5 years, monarch butterflies just weren't on my radar at all. And it's kind of a sad story, to be honest. There's far fewer monarchs on the landscape now than there ever has been. And it's such a iconic species that a lot of folks can identify with. The butterfly's been petitioned twice in legislation, or legislation entered twice to identify it as the national insect. It's failed both times, but a lot of people connect with the monarch butterfly. And just this past year, there was a listing decision offered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, basically gave this a warranted but precluded status. Basically, the service is saying, based on what they know, the current threats, the current population, protection of this species is warranted, but it is precluded due to higher priorities. So I looked into this more. I sat in on a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conference call the other day, and I just want to share with you a little bit. So in 1997, just 4 years prior to the monument designation, there was about 1.2 million monarch butterflies, the western population. There's an eastern population, a western population. The numbers I'm going to share with you tonight are based on the western population, what we experience. And the eastern population is far more robust than the western. However, as a whole, they still are warranted for protections. But in 97, they figured there was about 1.2 million monarch butterflies in this western population. They started collecting their information to come up with their status review. And from the information they collected in 2019, they estimated there were about 30,000 monarch butterflies. That was the information that they fed into their warranted but precluded decision. The conference call I sat in on a couple weeks ago actually had some new information from their 2020 wintering counts. And they estimate there's less than 2,000 monarch butterflies in the western population. So it's just hard to even imagine. I mean, that's almost the population of Fort Benton, Montana, is all the more monarch butterflies we have in the western population. So what can we do? Again, BLM, that triggered a thought. I forgot to talk about Wood Bottom. So Wood Bottom is an area where BLM is actively farming. It's quite odd, but we actually have tillage agriculture in the Wood Bottom area, right there at Loma and Decision Point. And we're starting to think if we can go in with some of these crops and go into a perennial vegetation where we have pollinator type species, that will be beneficial. It's just one small piece to the puzzle. We are a habitat management agency. Largely, we don't do farming, but this is an opportunity where we can participate. The monarch butterfly is an obligate to milkweed. It definitely needs milkweed to exist. So this is just one small piece of the puzzle. I'm sharing it with you guys mainly as a public service announcement. If you as individuals would like to know more about it, you can get online at themonarchwatch.org. Then also the subject matter experts truly is the Fish and Wildlife Service who came up with this listing decision. So there you go. That's all I can share with you on the monarchs. One last slide here, and this is this is interesting to me. The Bighorn Sheep was definitely something that was noted in the proclamation in 2001. It was referenced as a premier herd in the continental United States, I think is what it said. And it made me go back and start looking at some of the Lewis and Clark Journal stuff. The first time they experienced a bighorn sheep was likely right inside the border there with Montana, North Dakota, somewhere around the Yellowstone. That was their first glimpse of sheep. And then on May 25th, they actually harvested their first sheep, and they actually took 3 on that day. And the journals say they harvested about 35 sheep over the course of their expedition. So bighorn sheep were important 200 years ago. They were important in 2001 to be listed as an object of the monument, and they continue to be important. Bighorn sheep were actually extirpated from the breaks, not necessarily the Missouri River Breaks Monument, but the breaks is a broader landscape in the 1920s. It wasn't until, the 1970s where sheep were brought in from the Sun River Range and brought into that as a transplant and an augmentation. So I can stop sharing. You guys saw the good pictures here. I'll stop sharing that. But it was 1970s when they augmented that population, and it's really been gangbusters since then. I mean, it truly did become a premier bighorn sheep herd. It was highly sought after for trophy reasons, great productivity, great recruitment, and a lot of that's in the broken badlands country of BLM managed lands, the CMR lands, and it's largely public lands. And some of the concerns with those expanding populations, as you get above carrying capacity, you're more susceptible to risk. And a lot of sheep in Montana are carriers of MOV, and that can lead to mass die-offs. And one of the objectives of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is to not let this herd get too big, if you will, to be susceptible to degradation of habitat, but also disease risk. So it has been a source population for many transplants. And with that said, I was able to participate. This was, my time to shine as touching critters and putting collars on animals. This past January, was able to participate with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and a couple other conservation groups to trap and translocate 50 sheep from the south side of the river, kind of in that 482 country north of Winifred, the Dog Creek type area. Collected 50 animals from there and put them in horse trailers and hauled them over to the South Fork of the Judith River. So pretty neat opportunity. So again, important 200 years ago, important 20 years ago, and they're still important today. And these break sheep are augmenting populations across Montana. So that was kind of my highlight of, hopefully not the year, but it was definitely fun to participate in that activity. That's all I have. That's what was prepared. Now it's time to answer any questions if folks have questions, or try to answer them.
Yeah, please feel free to either type into the chat box below, or we would love to again see your face, hear your voice. So unmute yourself and ask any questions that you have.
Jesse, I won't burden you with a follow-up Grizzly Bear question. I'll spare you that, but I just did want to chime in early and say, fantastic talk. Thanks very much for sharing this with us. It's encouraging. Yeah, you seem like the right guy for the job. I'm happy they found the right guy, and it sounds like you're really keeping tabs on a lot of the
right.
The whole picture, right? The whole ecosystem. So I think that's encouraging. I guess I should say I work for American Prairie Reserve. I'm a wildlife biologist over there, and it sounds like you guys are up to great stuff. So keep up the good work, and thanks very much for sharing it with us.
Appreciate that. Glad you're on.
Well, if nobody else has a question, I have a couple that I can throw at you. I know you mentioned a couple diseases plague with the prairie dogs and some of the stuff with the sheep. Is there anything else that you guys are concerned about with any of your wildlife populations, either like past that have been present and not so much anymore, or anything kind of on the horizon?
I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Relative to disease type stuff, I'm not really dialed into that, to be honest, Michaela, so I can't really speak to that. I know the obvious ones, like you mentioned, MOV with the sheep and plague with the prairie dogs, but again, so much of that's kind of outside of my wheelhouse. That's FWP. They're the managers of the critters, and put the faith in those guys to really be dialing in on that. Yeah, I guess that's all I could share with that one. Do you have something in mind? Do I need to know something?
No. I remember hearing something, and see, I'm no expert myself, so I remember hearing something about in the deer population, like their tongue swelling up, or
well, blue tongue is a episodic disease that they're susceptible to as well, and chronic wasting disease is making its way across Montana as well. But again, so much of that is really outside of the management of what BLM would be doing to influence how that moves across the landscape or doesn't.
That makes sense. Very good. See if anybody else has.
Yeah, I was just curious if you're in the loop at all with the pallid sturgeon recovery efforts.
So I'm getting more in the loop, Roger. It really hasn't been part of my duties, and to be honest, it's not part of my duties as a wildlife biologist, but just the fact that so much of the good habitat above the dam, or excuse me, above Fort Peck is on part of the CMR and the monument. I'm getting involved and working with Luke Holmquist, who's Fish, Wildlife, Parks biologist here in town. I actually did tune in a little bit to their pallid sturgeon recovery group meetings last week, so I'm dipping my toe in that group, but by no means claim to know a lot about pallid sturgeon.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that tight fence is better than a loose fence. And could you elaborate on that a little bit more for us?
You know, fences are, there's lots of ways to build a fence, but truly a tight fence is less problematic for wildlife than a loose fence. If it's like a banjo string, if a critter jumps over a banjo string, it likely can deflect it to some extent. A loose fence, they're more inclined to get hung up in it. And I made a career out of replacing fence in Miles City, literally hundreds of miles of fence. And, you know, that was one of the things I was pretty proud of in Miles City. So I say this from experience and traveling the landscape across these allotments and seeing woven wire fence that's in great disrepair that hasn't been maintained in 40 years. And a brand new fence immediately adjacent might be fiddle string tight and doesn't seem to have the amount of critters hung up in it as those loose fences. And I can't explain it, but I came up with a slogan. It wasn't my slogan, but tight fences make good neighbors. But I think tight fences are actually better for less entanglement for wildlife. By all means, if it's a bad fence, it's a bad fence. There's fences that just aren't good for wildlife, and woven wire in particular is not good for wildlife, and especially if it's topped with barbed wire. That's pretty much impenetrable in many regards. From my Miles City days, I have lots of mortality pictures from all kinds of critters hung up in woven wire fence. And one of the maybe good things, if you will, from wildlife movement standpoint is southeastern Montana was historically big sheep country. So there's a lot of woven wire still on the landscape out there. In my travels around the monument, I don't see a lot of woven wire fence. There's definitely some 5-wire fence, some 6-wire fence, but by and large, it's not as impermeable type fencing as you see in southeastern Montana.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Marcus, did you have something you were going to jump in on?
Yeah, I had a quick question. Jesse, did you see an increase in user days on the monument last year, and what kind of impact did that have if you did?
So the short answer is yes, and the recreation folks would know that a lot better than I. But I think FWP and BLM have both said somewhere around like maybe a 20% spike. I don't. That's what I've heard. I don't know if the numbers support that or not, but that's what the recreation folks are saying based on their fee envelopes. And that's what some of the fish, wildlife, and park folks were saying as well. And to be honest, from a wildlife standpoint, that's one of the things that gets challenging in the monument. It's such a narrow corridor on the river, and some of the great habitats for wildlife are the great habitats for the recreationalists. And a lot of this activity is focused towards getting shaded up underneath of a tree, and some of our better riparian woodland habitat for some of our songbirds, things of that nature. That's the same spots that recreationists are heading towards. So it's something that we definitely need to be aware of, but I can't speak to what the effect of maybe this past year could be. Just know that there's likely, there's something that may be going on there with that increased overlap with those preferred habitats, I guess. I know one thing, when I'm on the river with a jet boat, I like doing it a lot earlier in the year where there's not so many canoes, because coming off step in the river can be tough at times. And I almost ripped the foot off the jet this year. There was a big raft of canoes, and it's the respectful thing to do. You got to do it. But we were operating under low water. So come off step and man, almost took the bottom of the boat off. But operating in the river in earlier months prior to the big push was preferable for me, but there was a lot of activity on the river this year for sure.
Well, with that, I think we have just hit 7 o'clock, so we can start wrapping things up. Thank you so much, Jesse. You know, all your talk about not having too much about monarchs and grizzly bears. I think that was super interesting, and I'm sure everybody learned something about something tonight. So thank
Good.
you for taking the
Yeah.
time out.
Yeah.
And
Thanks
I'll just
for taking the time to tune in tonight. This was fun. I think it's a good way for folks to engage and learn. I really do.
yeah, thank you to everybody who tuned in. And if you want to revisit this or any of our other Tune In Tuesday events, you can find those now on our YouTube channel. Just type in Friends of the Missouri Breaks Monument. And our next Tune In Tuesday will be March 23rd with the BLM hydrologist for the monument. So make sure you check that out. We'll be sending out reminders as that gets a little bit closer. But with that, I will say good night. Thanks again for tuning in, and thank you, Jesse.
All right. Thank you all. Appreciate it.